morning, everyone. It's nice to be here. I guess I'm batting leadoff after Steve. So it's really good to be amongst a lot of brands that and suppliers that are ready to grow in the U.S. marketplace, as well as the importers and distributors are going to help facilitate that growth. So very simply, I'll just tell you in kind of one slide what Nielsen does, because I like to keep it simple to hopefully when people ask me, I can just simply tell people we measure what people watch and we measure what people buy. And we measure what people watch across not just TV, because you've probably heard of Nielsen TV ratings, but also across radio and online and anywhere that kind of your eyeballs go. And then we measure what people buy, what brands, what price they're paying at retail, what distribution, where, when, and why. We primarily do that sort of at the retail end of things, so where the consumer is buying the product, whether that be off-premise traditionally, and then, like Steve said, we'll be launching an on-premise measurement this year. So just at a kind of big picture level, who is your consumer? It's basically about 100 in the U.S. It's basically about 120 million U.S. adults who say they regularly drink. So some people on top of this once in a while might drink, but there's 120 kind of regular drinkers of beer, of wine, and of spirits in the U.S. That's really a staggering number if you think of it like relative to the total population of a bunch of countries. The bottom populations, that's not just 21 plus, that's their total population, whether they drink or not. So basically you can take a couple of those total countries together, that's equivalent almost to the number of people in the US who regularly drink. And they're buying your product from hundreds of thousands of on and off premise outlets, which is something that Nielsen tracks across the United States, that are legally allowed to sell various kinds of adult beverages. Not every store can sell every product, depends on what state and all that kind of complex legal stuff. But there's hundreds of thousands of on-premise, which is the red and blue off-premise outlets that are legally allowed. And that's in addition to some other sort of allowable distribution vehicles that are direct to consumer in some cases, especially sort of in the wine industry. And what are they spending? Well, they're spending about $218 billion of their money on beer, wines, and spirits in total. That's sort of an industry estimate. I think it's in the ballpark on and off premise together. About 45% of that is on-premise spending. About 55% of it is off-premise spending. That's the sort of the dollar split. It's more like 20-80 for volume, with 80 being the off-premise part. So that's the total prize. Of that, about a little less than half of that spent on beer, 37% on spirits, and about 15% on wine. And over the past 10 years, there continues to be a shift, significant shift really away from beer, with spirits being the major share gainer and sort of wine hanging in there. And really it's been millennials and Gen Xers that have sort of led that shift away from beer into spirits. Doesn't mean that within beer there's not lots of growth segments. There are, like craft beer, Mexican imports, etc., but there's a lot of sort of moving back and forth within the beer category that's kept that category not growing as fast as the other two. And remember, just one share point equals $2 billion. So even little shifts make for a lot of volume and dollars moving around. And the fact of the matter is that consumers increasingly drink across beverage types. So you're really, anybody that's got a beer or wine or spirit is really in competition with the other categories. So it's really a battle for the next pour. But I think this quote from Leslie Sprocco really did a nice job of talking about that battle, that every beverage is competing to be in my glass. It's not enough to be a great beer, cider, spirit, or wine to be my next pour. You better know how to grab my attention, seduce me with your story, and make me feel like price doesn't matter, which I think is a really good description of what the battle really is. Of course, these days, just to be on the lighter side, that's not the only battle out there, right? There's lots of other sort of battles beyond beer, wines, and spirits. It's probably appropriate for any basketball fans. We're right in the middle of March Madness. Then, of course, there's the political madness of things. It's kind of dangerous to talk about politics here, so I'm not really going to talk about politics itself too much. But what I think is fair game is there's other political sideline battles, like there's the hair battle. There's that one on the left side, and then there's the one on the right side that sort of battle things out. And actually, if you put them together, you get sort of a hybrid of the two. So if I stick with politics but think about alcohol at the same time, where do they intersect? So if you think about politics and where it intersects with alcohol, actually Donald Trump, he had a Trump vodka. He launched it, I think, in 2008, something like that. it actually didn't work out so well for him. So I'm not sure I think you can find Trump vodka on eBay somewhere, but it's not really at retail anymore. And he does own Trump Winery in Virginia that his son Eric runs. And actually he proudly displayed his wine at one of his press conferences the other day with Trump steaks and water. So it was kind of like an infomercial press conference, I guess is the best way to describe it. We also know that Hillary drinks wine. I mean, we've captured that in pictures. In fact, on occasion she has a drink and then has another drink and sometimes actually even has another drink, and it looks like she really enjoys it right to the last drop apparently. And then, lastly, we actually caught Bernie running around in his truck. And we know, again, we caught it in pictures, we know that he likes craft beer. In particular, he's drinking a craft beer from his state of Vermont. And I can only imagine, don't know this for sure, but I can only imagine that if he had his way, he'd be providing free beer, free wine, and free spirits to everyone, because that sort of seems to go along with what he generally likes to offer up. Okay, let me get back to some data points. Steve mentioned we got a lot of data. I'm not going to go through all the parts of it. What I'm capturing here is sort of the off-premise part. On the left-hand side, it's 15 plus 13 plus $36 billion worth of beer, wines, and spirits that we're measuring in off-premise today. We'll be adding on the on-premise throughout the course of the year. So let's just talk about the business. I'd say it's generally healthy. It's healthy generally, not in every spot. There's some spots not as healthy as others. And here are some of the kind of the growth images for beer, and I'm going to talk through a couple of these, but I just wanted to show kind of where some of the growth is coming from. In the beer side, in the wine side, you can see blends, rosés, different countries, direct to consumers, kind of a growth area. And then in spirits, there's brown spirits, tequilas, the craft side of spirits, etc. So that's what's kind of behind some of the growth factors. One area that isn't as healthy is really the on-premise these days for a whole host of reasons. Some of those are economy-based, some of those are consumer-based, some of that's technology-based and some competition, for the consumer dollar. So on-premise is pretty flat, and if you're flat while off-premise is growing, it means that the on-premise share is decreasing, right? So this is on-premise share of category dollars on top, on-premise share of category volume on the bottom. For each year from 2012, 13, 14, 15, and actually it's been even longer than that the on-premise restaurants, bars, et cetera, share of the total consumer spending has been going down. Again, a whole bunch of reasons. All I would suggest, I'm not going to go into it now, but all I would suggest is that if you have products that can help on-premise operators increase their business, they're probably looking for help these days. Whereas on the off-premise side, here's what we're looking at right now, and what this shows is volume growth in gold and value growth in green for 2015. And you can see a couple things. One is that value growth is growing faster than volume, so consumers are trading up, buying more expensive products, number one. Secondly, all three categories, beer, wine, spirits, are growing faster than consumer packaged goods overall, because we track 125 other categories at Nielsen. Spirits is growing the fastest, beer is growing the least, and wine is kind of in the middle, and it's been that way for kind of a couple years. And because consumers are trading up, the average price of what a consumer is spending today versus last year is up about 3%. Before that, it was up about 2%. So it continues to increase, and that's primarily not because of price increases, it's primarily because somebody's buying a more expensive product this year than they were last year on average. And we see that trade up pretty consistently. So if we take each of the categories and separate out kind of the low end versus the higher end, and so for something like wine, I think we cut it off around $11 or $12, low versus high. You see this really large distortion between the low end declines or flatness versus the high end growth. In the beer category, that's primarily driven by crafts as well as Mexican imports, and more recently some of the hard soda introductions. And so craft off-premise share, while it's only 13% nationally, which is actually pretty big, it gets much, much higher in certain channels. Like in the on-premise, it's about 33%. In some markets like Portland, it's over 40%. So there's quite a large variance. In wine, I mentioned it's kind of the higher end. In particular, I mean, we see growth kind of at all tiers. We see a lot of growth and a lot of volume in the 11 to 15 and 15 to 20 range. That's where there's a lot of activity and really strong double-digit growth. And then in spirits, growth is led by kind of super premiums, depending on the category. That can be 30 or 40 and up products. That's really coming from almost all segments, in particular whiskey. except for vodka and cordials, where it's not really the highest end that's driving the growth. It's more kind of in the middle. And then there's that kind of small craft segment that's small now in spirits, but it's growing, and there's a lot of activity, a lot of excitement around it. We estimate it's probably got about a 2% share, so not huge compared to craft beer, but certainly that'll get big. I don't know if it'll get as big, but it's certainly a growth area. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple slides on a couple of different categories. First of all, within the wine side of things. So, one big story is Prosecco's just still on fire. It's been for a couple years. It's still growing at like 35-40%. There's a few vignettes here that I'm not going to go through. I think we're making the slides available so you can look at them after. But let me kind of summarize what we're seeing. Beyond or behind the 35 to 40% growth is a lot of that growth, 2/3 of it is incremental. So it's bringing new people into the category, and people that were buying or have been buying other kinds of sparkling wine, or buying Prosecco, or people that are buying 1 bottle or buying 2 bottles and 3 bottles. So it's getting a lot of incremental growth. Still, a lot of it's kind of focused around New Year's, but there's many other occasions for sparkling through the year, and Prosecco, primarily because of its price point and how it's merchandising and promoting, it's helping to sort of flatten out that seasonal hockey stick that, to use my Canadian background, that usually happens with sparkling towards the end of the year. And then last thing, it's the fourth point. If you look at kind of where consumers buy sparkling wine, some buy it in both on and off premise, but there's a whole hunk of consumers that only buy it in off premise, another portion that only buy it in on premise. So if you're really trying to get to all the consumers who want to get at sparkling wine, you really need to kind of get to both on and off premise channels. If we look at varietals, so let me just explain this chart because it looks kind of funny with little bubbles and stuff like that, but the x-axis here represents the dollar growth rate versus a year ago, so 2015 versus 14, and the y-axis represents the volume growth rate. And then the size of the circle just represents how big the segment is. So something like, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay is much, much bigger than, say, Merlot or Zinfandel because they're smaller circles. So the key is, the size of the bubble, how big it is, and whether it's towards the top right-hand side. The top right-hand side represents the growth area, right? So varietal growth is led by Sauvignon Blanc. It's the best of the best. Growth is coming from both U.S. and New Zealand, followed by red blends, Pinot Noir, Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Grigio, and Rosé. It's really small, sort of on the right-hand side, but it's almost off the chart. So I've got an arrow going to the right because it's up about 37%. Red blends continue to be a significant growth factor, as you can see, and I think last time we looked, about 1/3 of all the new products coming into the marketplace that we were tracking were blends. So still a lot of activity, a lot of newness in the blends category, in particular red blends. If we look at import countries, and sorry, not just imports, but also a couple states here. Again, top right-hand side is a good place to be. New Zealand and Oregon, if you're looking at kind of one import country in one state, leads the way in terms of growth. But there's really significant growth coming from Italy, both in still wine and sparkling wine, and that's that big circle, along with France with premium rosé leading that charge. Washington State and even Portugal showing some pretty good growth. On the spirit side, so here we're just showing the different subsegments of spirits ranked from the number 1, which is whiskey, down to sort of the bottom, which is prepared cocktails. Anytime something is growing at double digits, it's in green. Anytime single digits, strong single digits in blue, and then flatness or declines are in red. So what really pops out is whiskey. This whole brown renaissance is really strong, really active, in particular at the higher end, along with tequila. And then cognac within sort of the brandy and cognac segment. So that's what stands out on the positive side. The more kind of flat categories are rum, gin, and then prepared ready-to-drink cocktails are in decline. Again, doesn't mean that every product within that is showing that way, but overall that's what it aggregates to. And within whiskey, like I said, it's really that higher end. It's bourbon, rye whiskey is really growing strong, the whole craft segment. And then on the import side, Irish whiskey as well as single malts, so again, the higher end. Then I mentioned on-premise that it's weak. So one thing, and this is some information from somebody that we work with that showed this chart, or I picked up some of this data, but one thing that on-premise operators are really looking for, because consumers are saying they're looking for, is strong interest in sort of this locally produced spirits. that could end up sort of as being handcrafted cocktails. So a large amount of interest in fresh, handcrafted cocktails if you have something to offer. So last 3 slides. I'm going to show sort of 3 things that aren't sort of product related, but just things that maybe you guys are thinking about, or if you're not, maybe should think about. So the first is that every week obviously has 7 days, but not all weeks are created equal in terms of their sales to consumers, especially when it comes to alcohol sales. So here's what every week looks like if we take the actual sales in a week and compare it to just what an average week would be, and then index it to, as 100. So anything above 100, it's a strong week. Under 100, it's a low week. And you can see these like big, ups and downs during the course of the year. And really, if I kind of lay holidays on it, that really drives sales. Some of these are on-premise, more on-premise, some are more off-premise, some are both. But that really should enter kind of, the significant ups and downs should really enter kind of your thinking about when consumers in particular are out there more prone to buying products than they would be otherwise. And there's lots of different holiday events during the course of the year. Different segments sort of are more developed in certain weeks than others, but it's kind of a big deal and something we look at all the time. The second is kind of around just technology changes as well as legal changes. It's going to dramatically offer kind of new and different ways of actually just getting liquid into the mouths of consumers. It may be the various online delivery companies. Laura, I do see you there. But Minibar, Drizzly, Saucy, and there a few others are continuing to grow and offer, again, different ways of getting product to the consumer in more convenient ways. And that certainly segment will continue to grow in my opinion. It may also be other online options, again, that consumers can order kind of from their desks, whether it be through a brick and mortar retailer that offers an online platform, or it could be a pure play online retailer like a wine.com, which grew 15% last year and is already pretty significant in size. Or it could be laws that allow different ways, again, of getting product to the consumer. In this case, sort of this is direct to consumer with an average price for a wine bottle of around $40. And we think that segment represents 5% roughly now of all the dollars for wine. And then the very last one is just consumer changes. Just all kinds of massive consumer changes that profoundly will impact things. The rapid aging of population, millennials, which are now the biggest generation now. Every millennial is over 21. There's about 79 million millennials, and they just think differently and have different ways of finding out about products, sharing that information with their friends, et cetera, and they're critical to growth. And then just huge multicultural growth, increasingly, in particular amongst younger generations. So I would just close with my last slide is the average liquor store today, not talking here about a liquor store per store like Total Wine and More or Binny's, but the average liquor store sells around 600 to 700 beer or wine or spirits products during the average course of the month. From a on-premise perspective, the average number of spirits products on a back bar is about 57 or say 60 products. So my question for anybody that really has a brand is what makes you and your product differently? Because you've got to fight at the end of the day to get one of those slots if you're going through a brick and mortar sort of place. And therefore, what kind of consumer need are you meeting? And is it meeting the needs of the importers, distributors, and retailers kind of along the way to the consumer? And with that, since I'm wrapping it up now, I'm on time, and I thank you very much for your time.